This talk is all about climate breakdown and its impact. And I'm going to link it to two key areas of your geography programme. So causes of underdevelopment in LDCs and the issue of cohesion in the EU. Now, I'm sure when you stare at your geography folders, which are by now as thick and as heavy as the Doomsday Book itself, you remember that from Sankiem, it must feel like you've been assembling this massive 1,000-piece jigsaw on globalisation. Now, I really hate jigsaws, so I really sympathise with you and all the work you have to do. So this talk really is aiming to focus on one or two key pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. And by so doing, I hope to help clarify the big picture of globalisation itself. So don't feel obliged to write everything down, but I'd be very surprised that in the course of this talk, if there weren't one or two things that didn't leap out at you, that you didn't consider really useful. Okay, so we're going to start with causes of climate breakdown and a really sort of bleak picture of globalisation as the engine of the climate crisis created here by David Wallace Wells in his book Uninhabitable Earth, which I really recommend to you. And you can see here he states, we humans, we've been around for about 200,000 years. But in that time, or only in the last 30 years of our existence on Earth, have we exhaled more than half of the CO2 currently in the atmosphere. In other words, this crisis, this climate crisis, has been created almost within your own lifetimes by the dynamics of globalization. And it doesn't look like stopping. If you look at the COP29 speech from the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres, he called 2024 a masterclass in climate destruction. And I'll leave you a little time now to read the rest of the text of his speech, on the impact of climate breakdown on humanity. So how does this all link to your studies of LDCs? Well, let's go back to the actual definition of what an LDC is. It's a UN definition that I've taken from the UN website. So as you can see, they're low-income countries. They have severe structural impediments to sustainable development. They are vulnerable, highly vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks. And I've underlined that last part because that's really what we're focusing on when we're looking at climate breakdown. You can also see there's 45 on the list of LDCs on the UN list. If we go to the next slide, you can see where they're located. They are exclusively concentrated in Asia and Africa, with the vast majority being sub-Saharan African, and I've highlighted those in red. Now, if you read the text here from the UN Migration Report 2024, that's where you see the really, really strong links between climate breakdown wrought by the powerhouses of globalization, what you were studying when you were looking at globalization, whether it's the HICs, the TNCs, the nation states themselves, global cities, trade blocs, etc., and the disasters that are currently unfolding in LDCs. Take a careful read through this and the next slide and take some notes. I've highlighted Ethiopia here in the UN Migration Report because you'll remember when you looked at integration strategies, Ethiopia was one of your case studies because we looked at the issue of Chinese FDI pouring into Hawassa to create the SEZ, the Hawassa Industrial Park, and then more FDI to create a decent infrastructure linking Hawassa to the Chinese-owned container port in a different country, in Djibouti, and thereby offering landlocked Ethiopia a maritime route to the European markets via Suez. And when I say it like that, it sounds like integration strategies are something of a magic wand. But when you place it in the bigger context of climate breakdown, there is no way that a single integration strategy can mitigate the devastation that is being brought about by the climate crisis. And if we look at the bigger picture of sub-Saharan Africa, from this graph here with the top 10 African countries in terms of refugees and asylum seekers, I think you get a sense, well, A, of the scale of mass migration brought about by climate breakdown and indeed by civil wars, which are often closely linked to it, and the strains that these countries must be facing. Remember, LDCs are highly vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks with low levels of human assets. Well, that last phrase, low levels of human assets, is really personified by the poverty-stricken refugee. Now, our main LDC case study has always been the DRC, and as you'll remember, its causes of underdevelopment are incredibly complex and interconnected, and I know from experience that lots of students, whether it's in a mock oral or in the real thing, tend to go for the rather easy option of just sort of saying, well, I think it's because, the main reason is because the government is corrupt. Now, corruption is often part of the story, but when you look at the statistics of devastation wrought by climate breakdown on the DRC, you can see that it's the climate crisis that is very much central to the DRC's struggles. So again, take a few moments and take some good statistics, take some good notes from these. Last slide on LDCs, and I'm kicking myself here because I've misspelled Kinshasa, so many apologies in advance. But there you go, there's a couple of images which are far more important than my inability to spell, of the devastation wrought by the flooding from the Congo. So the sinkholes, the landslides, townships just being wiped away by the sheer power of the floodwaters. And you might ask yourself in an LDC, what sort of integration strategies can mitigate all of this? Okay, so let's move or turn our attention now to Europe, or more precisely to the march of the extreme right in Europe and its impact on EU cohesion. I've given you a definition of what cohesion is from the European Investment Bank, and you'll remember when you did all this, you looked at huge amounts of money and different funds that are pouring investment into different regions of Europe, whether it's through the Just Transition Fund or the Cohesion Fund or the ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund, all with the aim of creating cohesion through a greater sense of perhaps equality between the different economies to try and close that gap between core and periphery. But the fact is, something else is happening to Europe that's really eating away at the political fabric of the EU. And here's another quote from David Wallace Wells, and he identifies that in 2011 something happened, okay, with a million Syrian refugees arriving in Europe as a result of civil war inflamed by climate change. Something happened to the politics of Europe. In other words, that lurch to the extreme right. And he says that's the moment, really, when the populism acquired its momentum, something that the entire Western world is going through, suffering from the aftershocks, if you like, of the panic produced by the shock of those migrants. And on the right, there's an infamous poster by Nigel Farage's UKIP party during the Brexit referendum in the UK in 2016. I think this is probably one of the first warning signs that politics was shifting to the right, and that the centre ground of politics was no longer a sort of safe ground, if you like, or a bastion of stability. So there you go. There is Farage's poster from 2016 on the left now, but it's exactly the same poster has recently been used in Hungary, and that's the poster on the right. So it's the same image and the same narrative, of mass migration being presented as an invasionary force threatening the very fabric of society. That is, to a T, that is the sort of the narrative of the extreme right, what they are trading on. And here's a few statistics which perhaps go to emphasize that point. You can see the rise of migration to Europe, the migration flows on the left, and the correlation with the rise of the far right on this slide on the right hand side. That's from 2023. Now we all know that here in France the ground has shifted once more significantly since then, with the RN winning the EU election and then making massive gains in the Assemblée Nationale from the legislative elections. Now I've just taken, copied and pasted an article by Gordon Brown, the ex-Prime Minister of Great Britain, okay, for the 3 years from 2007 to 2010. And I'll leave you again to sort of read through this and take some notes on what Brown feels is happening in Europe and the agenda of the extreme right, the narrative they are creating, and the rhetoric they are using to normalise that sense of hostility and fear of migrants. Now, in terms of cohesion, what does this all mean? Well, as I mentioned before, we can imagine EU cohesion in so many ways, from the ERDF, just transition, cohesion, the TEN-T infrastructure project. But cohesion itself fundamentally depends on the nature of EU politics. On the left slide, I've just given you some of the criteria, from the Copenhagen criteria, which you might well remember is something that all member states have to fulfill in order to join the EU in the first place. So in other words, they all have to be fully functioning democracies. The EU is, in theory, exclusively a democratic club. You can't get in if you're not one. But what we're witnessing here is something wholly unexpected. With the rise of the right wing, not only comes a profound Euroscepticism and hostility to the EU, but a major decline in democracy itself, to the point at which Hungary was classified as an electoral autocracy by the EU Parliament in September 2022. And you can see it is not alone in terms of that democratic slide. That seems like a really important point that you would wish to make if you're looking at the strains on EU cohesion. So what does the future hold? Well, goodness me, it doesn't look like this problem. These are the great problems of our lifetime, and they are not going to go away. So if you look at another quote from the COP29 conference, which many of us look to rather naively as something of a magic wand in terms of finally finding resolutions to the climate breakdown, but you can see from the quote below, oil and gas was described as a gift from God by the OPEC General Secretary. And then on the right, a quote from Donald Trump, US President in waiting, who said, when we're going to get in, we're going to drill, baby, drill. We are going to drill for more and more oil. And certainly the response of climate scientists is one of horror and despair. You can see the quote on the right. The nation and world can expect the incoming Trump administration to take a wrecking ball to global climate diplomacy. There you have it. So you've got climate breakdown wrought about by globalisation having a huge impact on underdevelopment in LDCs, defined as they are as countries that are vulnerable to environmental shocks. You're seeing climate breakdown as the engine of mass migration, and mass migration itself being fundamental to the march of the extreme right in Europe, as that is the narrative from which they draw their ideology, and that itself is acting as a wrecking ball, to use that phrase again, to the cohesion of the EU. There you go. That's my jigsaw pieces. I hope that is food for thought for all of you, and really helps you to perhaps approach one or two questions about globalization from a different angle.